Good morning, everybody. We are reading Gulliver's Travels, and we are now on chapter 9. The title of this chapter is A Voyage to Brobdingnag. For the most part, the return voyage was uneventful. I stayed in England for only 2 months, for my great desire to see foreign countries did not leave me. Thus, I went to the harbor to find a ship. I am a ship's surgeon, I told the captain of the Adventure. Then you shall be my ship's surgeon, he replied. By nightfall, I was far at sea, bound for India. We sailed for many weeks. After the Adventure rounded the tip of Africa, a fierce storm overtook us near the island of Madagascar. The storm raged through the night. By morning, it was over. The sun rose over the calm sea, but we were completely lost. An island, the lookout shouted, pointing at a dark shadow on the horizon. Prepare a boat to investigate, the captain ordered. I would like permission to go along, I said to the captain. Permission granted, he said. The island didn't have a harbor, so we beached our small craft on the rocky shore. I'm going to explore this place, I told them. I wandered a short distance up the coast. There were no signs of life anywhere, so I turned around and headed back to the boat. A terrifying scream filled the air. I raced down the beach to see what had happened. I reached the top of the sand dune just as a giant shadow plunged everything into darkness. The boat and the Adventure were gone. Something had caused my crewmates to abandon me. As suddenly as it appeared, the shadow vanished. I was alone on an unknown island, a castaway. I staggered away from the beach, stunned by this cruel twist of fate. I stopped at the top of a steep hill and I gazed inland. What is this place? I gasped. I could not believe my eyes. The countryside below was covered with fields of grass over 20 feet tall. Hedges as high as church steeples surrounded the fields. Treetops were hidden in the clouds. Everything was gigantic. I stumbled down the hill to a wide road at the base of a hedge. A huge wooden stairway was built over the hedge, and the steps were over 6 feet high. The steps are for crossing the hedge, I exclaimed. But for whom? The ground began to shake, and thunder filled the air. An earthquake, I screamed, and I dashed into the tangle of hedge for safety. The sky grew black, and I was sure the earth would open up and swallow me. And then I heard voices. They were the loudest I have heard in my life. I peeked out of my hiding place. 3 men approached on the road, but it wasn't a road at all. It was the narrow path, and the men on it were over 60 feet tall. The men were ordinary field workers. Each one carried a scythe over his shoulder with a handle as big as a ship's mast. They covered more than 30 feet with a single step. They're giants, I gasped. The leader spoke to the others in a language that I had never heard. His voice boomed like cannon fire. The men nodded and climbed the steps to the field on the other side. They went to work at once, cutting what I thought were trees. I looked again. They're corn, I said in astonishment. But the stalks are the size of full-grown trees. My mind raced back to Lilliput. In that strange land, I was the giant. Here, I was as small as a Lilliputan, and the men in the field were the giants. A rush of air knocked me to the ground as the sharp blade of an immense scythe passed inches over my head. Stop! I screamed. I am a person down here. A foot as big as a cottage hovered over me, ready to crush me into the dirt like a bug. Don't squash me, I pleaded as loud as I could, and I knew my voice was like a cricket chirp to the men as big as English walnut trees. I screamed again. The foot paused and then landed gently alongside me. The blast of air knocked me onto my back. A giant hand reached down for me. The fingers opened and then paused as if I were a tiny animal that might bite him. I'm a man just like you, I shouted. Well, not quite, I added. The giant grasped me by the waist, between his thumb and his forefinger, and he lifted me into the air so fast that I nearly fainted. The giant held me in front of his face for a moment. Put me down, I cried. I twisted and I squirmed, but he was much too strong. I looked into his huge eyes and I put my hands together as if praying. Please don't hurt me, I begged. The man had no idea what I was saying, but the sound of my voice and my appearance told him that I was not a wild creature hiding in the corn like a field mouse. He put me inside his shirt pocket, and he hurried to his master. The field hand put me on the ground, and the other giants gathered around me in a circle. They stared down at me as if I were a chipmunk. "I won't try to escape," I said as loud as I could. I knew what it was like trying to hear someone as small as your finger. I dusted myself off and walked back and forth to show that I wouldn't run. The farmer spread his handkerchief on the ground and nudged me into it with his finger. He wrapped me in the kerchief and plucked me into his pocket. After a very bumpy ride, the kerchief opened and I found myself in the giant's house. It was huge. The farmer put me in the palm to show me to his wife. "Eh," she squeaked. The sound deafened me. The wife backed away as if I were a spider, but her curiosity soon got the better of her. She put her nose very close to my face. I took off my hat and I bowed graciously. "I am at your service, madame," I said. She smiled. I knew that she would be my friend. The farmer placed me in the center of the dining room table where his family was eating dinner. The table was 30 feet high, so I stayed safely in the middle near the mountain of food on an 8-foot platter. The farmer's wife cut a tiny piece of meat into crumbs the size of turnips and handed them to me as if I were a little bird. "Thank you," I said. "I am quite hungry." I took my knife and my fork from my pocket and cut the crumbs into pieces small enough for me to eat. The whole family chuckled with delight. The farmer motioned to me to come to his end of the table. It was a long walk off, so I ran. I had to dodge bread crusts as big as logs and crumbs as big as rocks. Halfway across the table, I was grabbed by a huge hand and whisked into the air. The farmer's young son, a lad of about 10, held me over his head like a toy soldier. "Put me down," I pleaded. My heart pounded, and I knew I would be killed if he dropped me. Luckily, the farmer snatched me away and put me safely on the table. He raised his hand to punish the boy. I ran to the farmer and I shouted for his attention. "Don't hurt him," I cried. I knew I wouldn't last long in a house with a mischievous boy who had been spanked on my account. I dropped to my knees to beg for the farmer's mercy. The master understood and he put his hand down. The boy returned to his chair. I knew that I had made another friend. No sooner did I turn away than a thrumming noise filled the room. It was louder than a factory full of weaving machines. But it wasn't a machine. It was a purring black cat, as big as an elephant. It sat on the farmer's wife's lap, staring at me and licking her lips. I knew if I ran, the cat would sense my fear and I would be doomed. I stood as tall as I could and I drew up my sword. I walked boldly to the end of the table without taking my eyes off the creature. I wagged my sword in her face. "I am not your lunch," I said firmly. The cat drew back. I replaced my sword with a flourish. I did not have to fear her anymore. After the meal, the farmer's wife took her baby into her arms. The infant was as big as 2 elephants. He thought I was a toy. Reaching with his chubby hands, he grabbed me from the table and popped my head into his mouth. "Let me out of here," I screamed. The baby spit me out and I fell towards the floor and certain death. The farmer's wife shouted something I did not understand and spread her apron over her lap. I plopped into it like a plum falling into a pillow. I was so weak with fear I could not stand up. The farmer's wife carried me to a 300-foot room. It was a 60-foot bed that was at least 25 feet off the floor. She put me in the middle of the bed like I was a favorite doll, and she left the room. No sooner did the door close than 2 rats the size of prize pigs entered. They smelled me and crawled onto the bed to investigate. They were big enough to devour me in a single bite. "Go away," I shouted. Instead, they attacked. The first rat stood on its hind legs and lunged for my throat. I drew my sword and I plunged the blade into the beast's belly. It fell dead. The second rat spun around and jumped to the floor, shrieking with fear. "I won't sleep with a dead rat on my bed, no matter how big it is," I said. I grabbed the dead rat by its 6-foot tail and I dragged it to the side of the bed. I gave it a kick and it fell to the floor. I was exhausted. I dropped to the bed and I instantly fell asleep. And that is the end of chapter 10.